It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind that usually brought warmth and comfort to the small, tightly knit town where Grace and her family lived. But today, a heavy silence hung over the courtroom as everyone gathered to hear the verdict. Grace sat at the defendant's table, her hands clenched tightly, her eyes focused straight ahead, trying to hide the anxiety churning in her stomach. To her left was her lawyer, a young and inexperienced public defender who looked almost as nervous as she felt. Grace's husband, James, sat directly behind her, his gaze unwavering and his presence strong, though his face revealed a simmering anger barely held in check. The courtroom was packed. More people than usual had shown up for what should have been an ordinary hearing. News had spread quickly throughout the town about Grace's case, though the details were murky. To some, it seemed trivial, a minor altercation blown out of proportion. But to others, especially those who had experienced similar injustices, this was more than just a simple case. This was about power and prejudice, two forces that had shaped their town for far too long. The judge entered the room, his robe flowing as he took his seat behind the bench. Judge Whittaker was an imposing figure, a man whose reputation preceded him. Known for his strict interpretations of the law and his notorious lack of empathy, he was feared by many who entered his courtroom. But today, as he adjusted his glasses and glanced down at Grace, there was something darker in his gaze, something that only a few in the courtroom could recognize: disdain. "Ms. Grace Evans," he began, his voice cold and commanding, "you stand before this court accused of theft and assault. Though the charges are minor, they are not without weight, especially in the eyes of the law." Grace took a deep breath, holding her composure as best she could. She knew the charges were unjust. The incident had been nothing more than a misunderstanding at a local grocery store, a place where she had shopped for years, known by everyone, respected by most. An accusation of theft had been thrown her way by an elderly woman with connections, claiming Grace had taken a package of batteries without paying. The argument had escalated, words had been exchanged, but no violence had occurred. She thought it would blow over, that the truth would come out in the end. But now, looking at Judge Whittaker's expression, she wasn't so sure. The judge's voice droned on, each word feeling like a nail driven deeper into Grace's chest. He listed out the supposed evidence, none of which had made sense. Her lawyer had argued her innocence, pointing out the lack of any concrete proof, but the judge seemed to have his mind made up long before the defense had even begun. As he spoke, Grace's heart pounded louder in her ears. The people in the room sat on the edges of their seats, watching her every move. She could feel their eyes on her, judging her, and the weight of it felt crushing. Judge Whittaker paused, his lips curling into a slight smirk as he looked down at Grace. "It's the decision of this court," he said slowly, "that given the evidence provided and the need to maintain law and order, a strong example must be made." He let the words linger, enjoying the effect they had on the room. "Grace Evans, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, shocking everyone into silence. Grace's vision blurred, the world around her spinning as the weight of his words sank in. Life in prison. Her hands shook, and her breath caught in her throat. She felt as if she was drowning, gasping for air as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. Behind her, she heard James stand up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your Honor, this is an outrage," he shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom. The spectators murmured in agreement, some gasping, others staring wide-eyed at the judge. Judge Whittaker looked at James with an air of indifference, barely acknowledging his outburst. "This is a court of law, Mr. Evans. Sit down, or I'll have you removed," the judge said, his voice cool and unyielding. James clenched his fists, his face contorted with anger, but he remained standing, his presence a silent but powerful protest. No one in the room knew yet that James was more than just Grace's husband. He was the town's mayor, a quiet but influential leader who had worked tirelessly for years to make their town a place of unity and fairness. He had hoped to keep his position unmentioned, believing that Grace's innocence would be enough to clear her name. But as he stood there, watching the judge pass down this incomprehensible sentence, he knew he could not remain silent. The judge's eyes flickered with a hint of recognition, perhaps understanding that he had underestimated Grace's support. But he quickly dismissed it, his arrogance overpowering any second thoughts. "Take her away," he ordered, motioning to the bailiffs. 2 guards moved forward, their faces a mix of sympathy and duty. They gently took Grace by the arms, lifting her from her seat as she stared blankly ahead, still in shock. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her husband stepped forward, reaching for her hand as she was led away. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice thick with determination. "I promise you, Grace, this isn't over." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Grace was escorted from the courtroom, her family and friends standing helplessly by. Some in the audience began to murmur, anger bubbling beneath the surface as the injustice of the situation became painfully clear. Many of them had seen Grace's kindness firsthand. She was a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others, never causing harm, always going out of her way to lend a hand to those in need. As she disappeared through the doors, a ripple of defiance began to spread through the courtroom. People who had once been content to let things slide, to turn a blind eye to the biases and prejudices that had subtly shaped their town, were beginning to see the truth for themselves. They could see now that this was not just an isolated incident. This was a symptom of a deeper sickness in their community. The judge cleared his throat, signaling the end of the trial, but his usual authority felt weakened. The crowd was no longer just a passive audience. They had witnessed something they couldn't ignore, a betrayal of justice that left them questioning their own roles in allowing this man to wield such unchecked power. Outside the courtroom, James stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters and townspeople alike. His face was set with a steely resolve, his eyes fixed on the courthouse doors. He knew he couldn't allow this injustice to stand, not just for Grace's sake, but for everyone in the town who had ever been wronged by the judge's biases. As the crowd gathered around him, he took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice carrying a strength that demanded attention. "Today, we have witnessed a grave injustice," he declared, his words resonating with a mix of sorrow and determination. "But this is not the end. This is just the beginning of a fight we can no longer ignore." Grace's life had always been ordinary but fulfilling, centered on her family, her work, and her commitment to her small, tight-knit community. She was known by her friends and neighbors as a warm-hearted woman with an endless well of patience and kindness. In a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, Grace was the kind of person others trusted, someone they'd call on in times of need or for a comforting word. And she took pride in that. Every day, she poured her heart into her family, especially her children, whom she loved fiercely. That morning began like any other. Grace woke up early, slipping out of bed quietly so as not to disturb James, who had been working late the previous night. She brewed a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen, as she began preparing breakfast. She took pride in starting her family's day off right, laying out bowls of oatmeal topped with fresh fruit, pouring juice, setting out toast. It was the kind of morning ritual that grounded her, a few moments of peace before the day's busy routine began. Her kids came down one by one, yawning and sleepy-eyed, mumbling their good mornings before digging into their breakfasts. Grace loved these moments, listening to their stories and dreams from the night before, laughing at their silly jokes. She felt the warmth of family surround her, a feeling of completeness that seemed almost sacred. And as she glanced at James, who had finally come down to join them, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Despite the challenges life had thrown their way, they had built a good life together, rooted in love and mutual respect. Later that morning, she had errands to run. Nothing unusual, just a typical day of picking up groceries, stopping by the post office, and visiting the small library where she volunteered part-time. She enjoyed walking through the town, greeting neighbors, and catching up on the latest gossip. Her familiar route a reminder of the community she had helped build and shape in her own quiet way. In this town, Grace felt safe, anchored. These were people who had watched her children grow up, who had been there for her in times of hardship, and who she believed knew her heart. She entered the grocery store, the familiar chime of the doorbell greeting her. As she moved through the aisles, picking up her usual items, she felt a strange tension in the air. She noticed Mrs. Porter, an elderly woman with whom she'd had a few minor disagreements in the past, watching her from a distance. Mrs. Porter was a woman of influence, an old money type who never let anyone forget her family's place in the town's history. She'd always looked down on Grace and her family, though they'd never had any significant altercations. Grace had learned to brush it off, understanding that some people's prejudices were rooted too deeply to ever change. But today, Mrs. Porter's gaze felt different, sharper, more intense. Grace tried to ignore it, focusing on her shopping. As she reached the checkout, she felt Mrs. Porter approach, her posture rigid, her lips pursed into a thin line. "Excuse me," Mrs. Porter's voice cut through the air, loud enough to draw the attention of other shoppers. "Did I just see you put those batteries in your purse?" Grace's heart skipped a beat, taken aback by the accusation. She looked down, confused, before realizing that she had placed the batteries in her cart earlier and had forgotten to put them on the counter. "Oh no, Mrs. Porter," she replied calmly, trying to keep the situation from escalating. "I'm sorry if it looked that way, but I must have just forgotten. Here they are." She placed the batteries on the counter with a gentle smile, hoping to diffuse the tension. But Mrs. Porter wasn't appeased. Her voice grew louder, more accusatory. "This isn't the first time I've noticed you acting suspiciously in this store, and I think it's high time someone called you out on it." Grace's stomach tightened. She felt eyes turning toward her, whispers starting to ripple through the store. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, her sense of comfort and belonging quickly replaced by a feeling of isolation. She could see judgment in the eyes of those around her, people she'd known for years, people she'd shared her life with. The weight of Mrs. Porter's words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory, and Grace's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. "Mrs. Porter, please," Grace said, her voice quivering. "This is just a misunderstanding. I've never stolen anything in my life." She wanted to believe her neighbors would see the truth, would understand that this was nothing more than a mistake. But Mrs. Porter's influence was powerful, and her words held weight. Grace could see the doubt beginning to settle into the eyes of those around her, doubt that stung more deeply than any insult. As the situation escalated, the store manager approached, his expression a mix of uncertainty and discomfort. "Perhaps we should take this outside," he suggested, trying to diffuse the growing tension. Grace agreed, hoping that once they stepped away from the prying eyes of other shoppers, reason would prevail. But as they moved outside, Mrs. Porter's accusations only grew more intense. She spoke in a voice laced with righteous indignation, painting Grace as a habitual thief, a threat to the community's integrity. Grace stood there, helpless, as Mrs. Porter's words twisted her actions into something sinister, something that felt far removed from the truth. The accusations grew heavier, until finally, the store manager made a call to the local police, hoping to resolve the matter swiftly. Within minutes, a police car pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out. Grace's heart pounded as she watched them approach, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She tried to explain, to tell them that this was nothing more than a misunderstanding, that she hadn't done anything wrong. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears, lost in the flurry of accusations and the weight of Mrs. Porter's influence. She could see the officers exchanging glances, their expressions hardening, as if they'd already made up their minds about her guilt. They took her by the arm, their grip firm but not rough, guiding her to the car. "Wait," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, you don't understand. This isn't right. I haven't done anything wrong." But her protests were met with silence, and before she knew it, she was being placed in the back of the police car, her hands cuffed in front of her. She could feel the stares of her neighbors, the murmurs of disapproval, the weight of judgment settling over her like a suffocating shroud. As the car pulled away, Grace's mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. She had always believed that her reputation in the community would protect her, that her years of kindness and integrity would stand as a testament to her character. But in a single moment, all of that had been stripped away, replaced by an image she didn't recognize, an image of guilt, of shame, of criminality. In the back seat, her mind drifted to her family, to her children who would come home to an empty house, wondering where she had gone. She thought of James, who had always stood by her side, who had believed in her strength and integrity. She knew he would fight for her, that he wouldn't let this injustice stand. But the fear lingered, gnawing at her resolve, whispering that perhaps this was bigger than either of them could handle. As they arrived at the police station, Grace was led inside, her world feeling smaller and more confining with each step. She could see the officers whispering to each other, casting glances her way, their expressions a mix of skepticism and pity. She was processed, her fingerprints taken, her belongings placed in a small plastic bag. The reality of her situation began to sink in, the walls of the station closing in around her. As she sat in a holding cell, waiting for James to come, she replayed the events in her mind, trying to understand how a simple shopping trip had spiraled into this nightmare. She thought of the people she had known her entire life, the friendships and connections she had built, and wondered if they, too, believed the accusations against her. The weight of betrayal settled heavily in her chest, a sense of loss that felt almost unbearable. And yet, beneath the fear and despair, a spark of defiance remained. She knew her own truth, knew that she had done nothing wrong. And though the road ahead seemed uncertain, she vowed to herself that she would not let this injustice define her. This was her life, her story, and she would fight to reclaim it, no matter the cost. The hours crawled by in the small holding cell, the cold cement walls pressing in on Grace, who sat on a hard bench, her hands resting in her lap. She had lost track of time, and each minute felt like an eternity. She could barely comprehend the nightmare she found herself in. Just that morning, she'd been surrounded by her family, sipping coffee and sharing laughs with her children. And now, here she was, isolated and accused, her entire life seeming to hang in the balance. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the occasional echo of footsteps in the hall outside her cell. She could hear the distant chatter of officers, the rustling of papers, and the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Every sound felt amplified, sharpening her sense of solitude and unease. She couldn't shake the feeling of shame, even though she knew she had done nothing wrong. She felt the crushing weight of being treated like a criminal. She had always believed in the justice system, that fairness and truth would prevail in the end, but that belief was now teetering, tested in a way she had never imagined. Suddenly, she heard voices approaching, familiar but tense. She sat up straighter, hope flickering in her chest as she recognized James's voice. He was speaking in a low, urgent tone to the officer on duty, trying to keep his voice calm, but she could hear the edge of desperation beneath it. The officer was trying to placate him, but Grace could sense the frustration in James's words. He had always been the type to keep his emotions under control, but this ordeal had shaken him as much as it had her. Moments later, James appeared in front of her cell, his face pale but resolute. He looked at her with a mix of anger, determination, and an unmistakable love that softened his expression despite the fury she could see simmering just below the surface. His jaw was clenched, and his hands were balled into fists. But as soon as he met her gaze, his shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. He reached through the bars, his fingers brushing against hers, a small gesture of comfort in an otherwise bleak moment. "Grace," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. This shouldn't be happening. I'm doing everything I can to get you out of here." Grace managed a faint smile, though her eyes brimmed with tears. "I know, James. I know you're doing everything. I don't understand how this got so out of control." She took a shaky breath, struggling to keep her composure. "All I did was go to the store. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," James said firmly, his hand tightening around hers. "I know you didn't. This is all a setup, a terrible, cruel setup. Mrs. Porter, she's been stirring up trouble for a long time, using her connections to get what she wants. I always thought we could just ignore her, that she'd never go this far, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "But this is beyond anything I ever imagined." As they talked, an officer approached, clearing his throat to interrupt their moment. James turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "I need to speak with her lawyer," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I want to know exactly what evidence you're holding her on. You have no right to keep her here without substantial proof." The officer shifted uncomfortably, but nodded. "Your wife's lawyer is on his way, Mr. Evans. We're following procedure here, sir. Please understand." James didn't back down, his gaze hardening. "Procedure or not, I want this resolved tonight. Do you understand?" There was an authority in his voice that few people knew he possessed, a glimpse of his role as the town's mayor, a fact he had kept hidden so far, not wanting to bring undue attention to the situation. But as Grace watched him, she saw something change in James. She could tell he was weighing his options, debating whether to use his position to force a resolution. She knew he was hesitant to reveal his identity, fearing it might complicate things even further, but his resolve seemed to harden as he looked back at her, his hand still holding hers through the bars. Soon after, Grace's lawyer arrived, a young, earnest man named David, whom she had met only briefly before the hearing. He looked harried and uncertain, clearly out of his depth, but he greeted her with a determined nod, trying to project confidence. "Mrs. Evans, we're going to get you through this," he assured her, though his voice lacked the weight of experience. David and James spoke in hushed tones, exchanging information, formulating a plan. James outlined the injustice that had unfolded, his voice filled with anger and disbelief. He detailed how Mrs. Porter's accusations had spiraled out of control, how a simple misunderstanding had been twisted into something much darker. David listened intently, scribbling notes and nodding as he absorbed each detail, his expression growing more serious with each passing minute. After discussing the plan, David approached Grace, his tone gentle but direct. "We're going to challenge this aggressively," he said, his voice brimming with conviction. "There's no solid evidence against you. This entire case is based on hearsay and Mrs. Porter's influence. We'll be asking the judge to reconsider the charges and possibly recuse himself from the case if we can prove bias." As David spoke, Grace felt a glimmer of hope, a small spark amid the darkness that had engulfed her. She knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but she also knew she wasn't alone. She had James, her lawyer, and hopefully, a few people in the town who would stand by her. And though fear lingered in her heart, she felt a surge of determination begin to take root. As the night wore on, Grace was allowed to make one phone call. She dialed the number of her oldest friend, Emma, a woman she had known since childhood, who had always been there for her in times of need. When Emma answered, Grace's voice trembled as she recounted the events, her friend listening in stunned silence. Emma's shock quickly turned to anger, her voice rising with indignation as she promised to rally support, to get the word out to anyone who would listen. "This isn't over, Grace," Emma said firmly. "You have friends here, people who know you and know that you'd never do something like this. We're going to fight this with you." The words bolstered Grace, giving her strength. She could almost feel the weight beginning to lift, though the fear remained, lurking in the corners of her mind. She knew that this fight would be grueling, that the power and influence of people like Mrs. Porter and Judge Whittaker would not be easily overturned. But she also knew she had something far more powerful on her side, the support of those who truly knew her heart, those who believed in her innocence. By the time morning arrived, Grace had settled into a strange sense of calm, a quiet resolve that steadied her. She watched as the first rays of sunlight seeped through the narrow window of her cell, casting a warm glow that seemed almost out of place in the sterile gray room. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes, reminding herself of the life that awaited her beyond these walls, the life she had built with love, patience, and kindness. She reminded herself of her children, of their smiles and laughter, of the promises she had made to them to always be there, to protect and guide them. She knew that no matter how difficult this ordeal became, she would hold onto that light, that love. And with James, her friends, and her own unwavering spirit, she would fight for the truth, for her freedom, and for the justice that had been denied her. This was only the beginning of a battle she hadn't asked for, but was now determined to win. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with townspeople crowding into every available seat, and even standing along the walls. Word of Grace's case had spread far beyond the usual circle of courthouse gossip, igniting a mixture of outrage and curiosity throughout the town. Most people couldn't believe that someone like Grace, a woman they knew as kind-hearted, reliable, and always willing to help others, was facing a life sentence over something so trivial. But whispers about Mrs. Porter's influence and Judge Whittaker's heavy-handed decisions added an air of tension to the crowd. People were there not only to support Grace, but to witness whether justice would truly prevail or if the town's ugliest power structures would win out. Grace sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded in front of her, her expression calm yet determined. James sat directly behind her, his face a mixture of quiet fury and hope. He knew this was their best chance, a final attempt to clear her name and reveal the truth of how bias and prejudice had shaped the nightmare she was living. Grace's lawyer, David, had spent days meticulously preparing his arguments, uncovering every thread of evidence that hinted at the underlying bias and prejudice within the case. He knew that in a battle against someone as powerful as Judge Whittaker, he would have to walk a fine line, choosing his words carefully yet delivering a punch that would resonate with the courtroom, and hopefully with the judge himself. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Whittaker entered, his expression unreadable as he took his seat. The tension in the air was thick, and everyone in the room could feel it. He glanced briefly at Grace, then looked out over the crowd, his eyes resting a fraction of a second longer on James, whose presence clearly unsettled him. Whittaker knew exactly who James was and the power he held as the town's mayor, but he was a man who had always believed in his authority as absolute, untouchable. The proceedings began, with the prosecutor presenting the flimsy evidence against Grace. Photos of the alleged stolen item, a package of batteries, and the testimony of Mrs. Porter were the primary pieces. Mrs. Porter, dressed in her finest pearls and projecting an air of self-righteousness, took the stand with a rehearsed confidence. Her voice dripped with disdain as she recounted her version of events, painting Grace as a troublemaker, someone who had shown clear disrespect and disregard for the rules. She cast herself as the victim, her words wrapped in a subtle but unmistakable layer of prejudice that only a few would dare to challenge openly. David waited patiently, listening to every word. He knew that while Mrs. Porter might appear untouchable to some, her testimony was filled with inconsistencies. When it was his turn, he approached her with a calm but direct demeanor, carefully deconstructing her story, exposing gaps, and asking pointed questions that revealed the flimsy nature of her accusations. Mrs. Porter's irritation grew with each question, her confident facade beginning to crack. She glanced repeatedly at Judge Whittaker, as if seeking his silent approval, but the judge's face remained impassive, betraying nothing. Finally, David turned to the judge and addressed him directly, his voice steady but resolute. "Your Honor, we're here today because of one woman's accusation, a woman who has well-known ties to this courtroom and has a history of using her influence to shape outcomes in her favor. We are talking about a minor, misunderstood incident that was blown out of proportion, leading to an unjust arrest and life-altering consequences for my client. This case should never have made it to trial." There was a murmur in the audience, a ripple of agreement mixed with disbelief. David continued, building momentum. Grace Evans is a mother, a community volunteer, and someone who has lived her life with integrity and kindness. She is not the criminal this courtroom has been led to believe. What we have here is not a matter of theft or wrongdoing, but of power and prejudice, exploited to ruin an innocent life. Judge Whittaker's face tightened, his jaw clenching almost imperceptibly. David knew he was treading on dangerous ground, but he pressed on, glancing briefly at James for strength before continuing. Furthermore, Your Honor, I would like to bring to light the unique position of Mr. James Evans, Grace's husband, who happens to be the mayor of this town. It is no secret that this relationship may have influenced this trial in ways that are both unethical and illegal. The tension in the room spiked, and all eyes shifted to the judge, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, his hands tightening around the gavel as if to anchor himself. David paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. I move to have this case dismissed on the grounds of insufficient evidence and request an immediate inquiry into the actions taken by this courtroom to ensure that such bias does not continue to shape our justice system. Judge Whittaker's face flushed, and his eyes flickered with something between anger and fear. He glanced around the room, the weight of the public scrutiny pressing down on him. He knew he was losing control of the narrative, his carefully constructed authority slipping through his fingers. But clinging to the remnants of his power, he cleared his throat, his voice cold and unyielding. This court does not tolerate interruptions or disrespect for the rule of law, he said, a hint of venom in his tone. Mr. Evans may be the mayor, but in this room, my word is law. The words hung in the air, a bold declaration that left a sour taste in the mouths of many watching. But David was undeterred, meeting the judge's gaze with an unwavering resolve. Your Honor, the law is not the whim of one man. It is a system designed to protect the innocent and ensure justice for all. And I intend to see that it is applied fairly today, regardless of any personal biases or long-standing influence. With a visible tremor of anger, Judge Whittaker called for a brief recess, retreating to his chambers to consult with his advisors. The courtroom buzzed with whispers and speculations, people sharing glances that carried both fear and hope. Some were astounded by David's boldness, while others felt a surge of exhilaration, as if they were witnessing a rare and powerful moment when truth might finally pierce through the darkness of bias and corruption. During the recess, James stepped forward, standing beside Grace and placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're getting through to him, he whispered, his eyes alight with a fierce determination. He's on the ropes, Grace. He knows he can't ignore this any longer. Grace looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and a newfound strength. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope that the nightmare might soon end, that she might be able to return to her family and her life, leaving this ordeal behind. But beneath her relief was a simmering anger, a desire for justice, not just for herself, but for anyone else who had ever been mistreated by those who abused their power. When Judge Whittaker finally returned to the courtroom, his expression was carefully controlled, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. He adjusted his robe, took his seat, and addressed the room with a forced calm. After reviewing the arguments and considering the evidence, or lack thereof, I have come to a decision. The room went silent, every eye trained on the judge. Grace held her breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she waited for the words that would determine her fate. This case is hereby dismissed due to insufficient evidence, he said, his voice grudging, almost resentful. Ms. Evans is free to go. The words were barely out of his mouth before a wave of relief swept over Grace, her body sagging with the weight of emotions she had kept locked inside. James pulled her into a tight embrace, murmuring words of reassurance as the room erupted into applause and cheers. But Judge Whittaker wasn't finished. He banged his gavel, calling for silence, his voice steely as he issued a final warning. However, let it be known that this courtroom will not tolerate disrespect for the rule of law. Any further outbursts or allegations will be met with the full force of this court. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air, a bitter reminder that while Grace had won her freedom, the fight against prejudice and power imbalances in the town was far from over. As they left the courtroom, surrounded by friends and supporters, Grace felt a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. She was free, yes, but she knew there were others who hadn't been so lucky, who hadn't had the support or resources to challenge the unjust system. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones and cameras thrust in Grace's face as questions were fired from all directions. But James held up a hand, silencing them, his voice strong as he spoke. Today was a victory for justice, but it should never have come to this. Our town deserves better. We deserve a system that serves us all equally, without fear or prejudice. This isn't over. We'll be working to ensure that no one else has to suffer the way my wife has. As they walked away, Grace felt a new purpose taking shape within her, a resolve to use her experience to fight for change, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. She knew this wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one in which she would take her strength, her pain, and her resilience, and use them to create a better, fairer town for everyone. After the verdict, Grace's story spread through the town like wildfire, capturing the attention of not only her neighbors, but of people from neighboring cities who saw in her trial a reflection of a broader struggle for justice. For days following her release, Grace found herself the subject of countless conversations, her face recognized, and her name whispered in nearly every corner of town. People came to her, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment, quiet injustices, and long-held fears that had kept them from speaking up. The community had begun to stir, their eyes newly opened to the influence certain figures held in their lives, and their desire for change was growing stronger. Yet, despite the newfound support, Grace was not without her challenges. The bitterness and anger of those who had taken pride in the old ways, the people who had supported Judge Whittaker and Mrs. Porter, now ran deeper than ever. In their eyes, Grace had challenged the system, and her victory had exposed cracks in the town's long-standing power structure. She received cold glares on the street from some of her former neighbors, and even anonymous letters filled with hateful words. A few local businesses, under pressure from Mrs. Porter's allies, quietly began to avoid her family, declining to serve them or looking away whenever she entered. But Grace was undeterred. She had already endured the worst, and her spirit was resilient. She knew that her experience, painful though it was, had shown the town a truth that couldn't be ignored, and she was determined to do something with it. She wanted to make sure that no one else would have to suffer the way she had, to build a community where everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from, would be treated fairly. Together with James and a few other community leaders who shared her vision, Grace founded an organization called the Fair Voice Coalition. The goal was simple but ambitious: to create a platform where people could come forward with stories of injustice, to bring about change through community support, and to ensure that every resident felt seen and valued. At first, it was a modest effort: meetings held in their home, discussions over coffee at the local diner. But the movement began to grow quickly. People were drawn to Grace's sincerity and the courage she showed, inspired by the fact that she had taken on the town's most powerful figures and had emerged victorious. The coalition's influence spread, attracting volunteers, donations, and even media attention from outlets interested in the movement born out of Grace's ordeal. They organized community forums, inviting people to share their stories, to speak out against discrimination, to discuss their fears and hopes openly. They even managed to bring in legal advisors and social workers to help guide those who were afraid to speak out, creating a safe space where people could find both support and solutions. For Grace, the work was rewarding but also draining. Each story she heard reminded her of her own, each tearful account bringing back memories of her time in that holding cell, the fear and uncertainty that had haunted her every minute. But every hug, every word of thanks, every small victory reminded her of the importance of what she was doing. She was no longer just fighting for herself, but for all the others who had been silenced for too long. As the Fair Voice Coalition gained traction, it also faced fierce resistance from the old guard, people who had held power in the town for generations and who were determined not to lose it. Mrs. Porter, humiliated by the trial, quietly fueled opposition, gathering allies to undermine the coalition. Through her extensive network, she began spreading rumors that the coalition was divisive and radical, that Grace and her supporters were disrupting the town's peace and turning neighbors against each other. She held private gatherings, inviting her most loyal supporters and discussing strategies to put a stop to this madness. In an unexpected twist, Mrs. Porter's vendetta took a personal turn. She managed to convince Judge Whittaker, who had stepped down from his position after the scandal, to join her cause. Though officially retired, Whittaker still held sway over some people in the town, and his voice lent weight to her efforts. Together, they attempted to tarnish Grace's reputation, questioning her motives and claiming that she was merely seeking revenge rather than justice. They spread rumors that she was untrustworthy, that she wanted to tear down the town's institutions out of spite. Grace and James soon found themselves at the center of a campaign of intimidation and sabotage. Flyers accusing them of wrongdoing were anonymously posted around town, meetings were disrupted by hecklers, and donations to the coalition mysteriously dried up as local businesses withdrew their support under subtle but undeniable pressure. They received veiled threats in the form of anonymous phone calls, and even found their car tires slashed one morning. The message was clear. The old guard wanted them to stop. But the resistance only fueled Grace's resolve. Instead of stepping back, she publicly confronted the smear campaign, refusing to be silenced. She addressed the rumors directly in a town hall meeting, speaking openly about the pressure she had faced and the people who were working against her. "I am not here to tear down this town," she told the crowd, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I am here because I love this place, because I believe in what it could be. But that dream means nothing if some of us are left behind, if some voices are silenced. We cannot have peace without fairness, and we cannot have justice without honesty." Her words resonated deeply with many in the crowd, particularly those who had known her all her life and had witnessed the kindness and compassion she had shown. The coalition continued to grow, slowly but surely winning over more people, even some who had once been skeptical. Friends who had drifted away came back. Neighbors who had once judged her began to see her in a new light, and the community started to shift. They began to see the coalition not as a threat, but as a beacon of hope, a chance to build something better together. In a surprising turn of events, Grace's work even began to draw support from younger residents who were eager for change and who saw her as a role model. They formed a youth branch of the coalition, organizing events, volunteering, and spreading awareness about issues of fairness and community responsibility. Their enthusiasm brought new life to the movement, and Grace found herself inspired by their energy, their passion, and their hope for the future. Even as the coalition gained strength, Grace never forgot the pain of her ordeal, the scars it had left. But she knew that she had a choice, to let those scars define her, or to let them become symbols of resilience, reminders of what she had overcome. She chose the latter, using her experience as a guiding force, a well of strength that she could draw upon whenever the fight grew difficult. And each time she faced a challenge, each time she stood up against the people who sought to silence her, she felt herself growing stronger, her voice clearer, her purpose sharper. Months passed, and slowly but surely, the coalition achieved its first real victory. They managed to push through a new policy requiring fair and impartial oversight of court cases, ensuring that any future trials would be freed from the influence of powerful figures like Mrs. Porter and Judge Whittaker. It was a small but significant step, a tangible result of their efforts and a sign that change was possible. The townspeople celebrated, many of them realizing for the first time that they held the power to shape their community, to create a town that was more just and inclusive. Grace's journey had transformed her, not just from a victim of injustice into a fighter but into a leader, someone who could inspire others to stand up for what was right. And in turn, the town was transformed as well, shifting from a place bound by tradition and fear into a community where people felt empowered to speak up, to question, and to demand better. As the coalition continued its work, Grace looked around at the faces of the people she had come to know and love, the friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had become part of her journey. She felt a deep gratitude for them, for their support and belief in her, and a profound sense of purpose in the work they were doing together. She knew that there were still battles to be fought. That change would not come easily or quickly. But with each small victory, each step forward, she felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. Standing on the steps of the town hall one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the town in a warm golden light, Grace felt a deep peace settle within her. She had been tested, tried, and nearly broken. But she had come out the other side, not only intact but stronger, with a purpose that went beyond her own pain. This was no longer just about her. It was about building a legacy of fairness and justice, about creating a place where her children and future generations could grow up knowing they were valued and heard. And as she looked out over the town she had fought so hard to change, she knew, deep down, that she would never stop fighting. As months turned into a year since her release, Grace's life had evolved in ways she could never have anticipated. What began as a painful personal battle had sparked a community movement, transforming her small town into a beacon of hope, resilience, and renewed accountability. The Fair Voice Coalition had grown beyond its initial goals, drawing people from neighboring towns who had heard Grace's story and wanted to see justice take root in their own communities. Grace had become a figurehead of this movement, not by choice but by necessity, carrying the torch for countless others who had felt voiceless for far too long. However, her journey was not without struggle. The quiet resistance from the town's old guard persisted, though it had changed its face. No longer able to use overt threats, Mrs. Porter and her allies resorted to subtle tactics to undermine Grace's efforts. They attempted to paint her coalition as radical, even dangerous, calling the movement disruptive to the town's long-standing values. Anonymous flyers would appear on doorsteps, calling Grace's supporters troublemakers, and warning that the coalition was dividing the town. A few local papers, controlled by Mrs. Porter's acquaintances, published opinion pieces that cast doubt on the coalition's motives, twisting its message to seem destabilizing. But Grace had learned to navigate these attacks, often meeting them with a quiet dignity that only drew more respect from her supporters. She responded to each smear with an open letter to the community, inviting anyone with concerns to attend coalition meetings, hear people's stories firsthand, and judge for themselves. Her transparency and steady dedication silenced many critics, and people began to trust her even more, seeing her as a grounded, unbreakable force. Yet, Grace faced her greatest test when she received an anonymous letter. It was written carefully, almost respectfully, but with an edge that unsettled her. The letter warned her to consider her family's future and to remember the boundaries that once kept peace in this town. Grace recognized the veiled threat, the intimidation meant to instill fear, and for a moment, it succeeded. She held the letter in her hand, her mind flashing to her children, to James, and to the life they had built. She knew that by challenging deeply rooted power structures, she had put herself, and perhaps her family, in a vulnerable position. Late that night, as she sat at the kitchen table, the letter lying before her, James joined her. He didn't need to read the words to understand the worry etched into her face. He placed a hand over hers, his touch grounding her, reminding her that they had come too far to back down now. "Grace, we've been through this before," he said, his voice steady. "They can't scare us out of doing what's right. You've shown this town what real strength looks like. They're afraid because they know they're losing their grip." She looked at him, finding comfort in his unwavering support. I worry about the kids, about what this means for them," she murmured. "I never wanted to put them in harm's way." James squeezed her hand. Grace, they're growing up watching their mother fight for what's right. They're seeing that when something's worth believing in, you don't back down. You're showing them courage. That's the best gift you can give them." The words strengthened her resolve, dispelling the fear that had threatened to creep in. She knew that the only way to honor the struggle she and so many others had endured was to keep going, to continue creating a safer, more just place for everyone. It was more than her battle now. It was a legacy. With renewed determination, Grace took the next step in her journey. She reached out to a regional advocacy organization, partnering with legal experts and social workers to formalize the coalition's mission, establishing it as an official nonprofit. This change allowed the coalition to gain broader resources and legitimacy, opening doors to funding and support that hadn't been accessible before. The town's council, reluctantly influenced by the coalition's growing popularity, approved a budget for a community review board that could oversee the town's courts and local government, ensuring fair representation and transparency in future cases. One day, as Grace and the coalition team prepared to meet with state representatives to discuss expanding similar review boards to nearby towns, an unexpected visitor arrived at the coalition's office. It was Judge Whittaker, who had been largely absent from the public eye since resigning after Grace's trial. He looked thinner, his once imposing presence diminished, but his expression was resolute.